There was a lot of complaints that the buyer or seller wouldn't see their final numbers until just before the closing, and literally, I mean, minutes before the closing.
Today we are talking to Melissa Godbury from Honing and Simone. Our topic is on closing disclosures. Melissa is going to go into closing disclosures and give us all the ins and outs and everything we need to know when we are signing the closing. So Melissa, good morning. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I am doing well. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us and help us understand the closing disclosure.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. So what is the closing disclosure?
Closing disclosure is a document that we sign at closing. Depending on whether you're the buyer or the seller, which I think we're going to touch on in a few minutes, it's a little bit different, but focusing on a buyer, the closing disclosure purpose is twofold. So the first purpose is to disclose the final figures. So it takes into account your purchase price and the amount you're borrowing from the bank, and it goes over all of the closing costs and all of the adjustments between the buyer and the seller, and comes up with the final figure that the buyer needs to bring to closing, or for a very lucky buyer, the amount that they might get back.
Okay.
And the second purpose is that it provides a detailed explanation of the buyer's loan terms. So it will tell them their loan amount, their interest rate, their monthly payment, what's included in that monthly payment, the breakdown, and also on one of the later pages in the closing disclosure, it tells them what they'll pay over the life of the loan when they take out that loan amount.
Okay, so that's interesting. So when you are sitting in front of your lawyer to do this, what questions should you be asking? Or is it too late to ask any question?
It's never too late to ask any questions. That's what I always say. And in fact, better to ask them when you have them than to let any slide until after the closing. Numbers are pretty much finalized at the time that you're at the closing table, unless if there was an error or a mistake that was caught, which is very rare because there are several prior versions of a closing disclosure that are circulated before we get to the final. And oftentimes, I can't speak for all attorneys, but we send out the closing disclosure in advance so that it can be reviewed with the client and any questions can be asked and numbers can be double checked if need be. But the attorney really should be going over everything in the closing disclosure, page by page, line item by line item, for the most part, so that the borrower understands what they're signing and what their charges are, although most of the time the borrower is familiar in advance. That's one of the beauties of the closing disclosure, is that it's very detail oriented and there are many versions of it that need to be disclosed leading up to the closing.
So what is the first version of it? Like before somebody even gets a loan, do they get like a pre-one, something like the good faith estimate?
Yeah. So there is something just like the good faith estimate that we used to have when we used to do HUD settlement statements, only it's called a loan estimate. And it looks very much like a closing disclosure. It's a little bit different, but the loan estimate is typically an estimate of all of the charges that the borrower will see on the closing disclosure at the time of closing, less any adjustments between the buyer and the seller, and also only with an estimated number for any documents, for any figures that are determined by date. So for instance, if a borrower has prepaid interest on their loan, that depends on the closing date. If they're escrowing for taxes or insurance, those figures also depend on the closing date. So those are really rough estimates, but the rest of the estimates are usually pretty dead on.
Oh, so that's why sometimes the estimates you get changes by closing, because some of them are just rough estimates. I mean, the numbers changes. Yeah.
Yeah, so TRID, which I know you mentioned, TRID is a federal mortgage regulation, and TRID requires that a lender provide a closing disclosure to the borrower at least 3 days prior to closing. And if the lender can't do that for any reason whatsoever, the closing actually has to be extended to allow that to happen under this federal mortgage regulation. And when you get the estimated closing disclosure 3 days or maybe more than 3 days prior to the closing, it has all of the final figures to a certain extent. So the loan amount has to be final, the interest rate has to be final. Any origination fees or third-party fees that the lender is charging has to be final. Any loan program details have to be finalized. And at the same time that they send that closing disclosure to the borrower, they're sending it to the closing attorney, who's then reviewing it to make sure that the attorney's fees are correct, the title insurance costs are correct, the recording costs are correct, and they're also adding in any figures that are adjustments between the buyer and the seller. So typically, if there are changes from the estimated CD to the final CD, it is usually those adjustments between buyer and seller, such as tax adjustments or condo fee adjustments and things of that nature.
Okay. So what is the purpose of the 3-day wait?
So back in the day when we used to have the HUD settlement statement prior to October 3rd, 2015, when the closing disclosure came into play, there was a lot of complaints that the buyer or seller wouldn't see their final numbers until just before the closing, and literally, I mean, minutes before the closing. And even earlier than that, back when I would say like 2003-ish, at that point, even the interest rates could change. So the borrowers would be expecting one interest rate and they would get to the closing and it would be a different interest rate or a different loan amount. So TRID was really put into play to regulate the disclosure of these numbers by the mortgage industry to consumers and to protect the consumers by giving them this 3-day period to review their loan terms and closing costs from the lender.
So it doesn't mean they can back out, because the terms with the purchase and sale stays. If you back out last minute, you may lose your money. It's just for you to have an idea of what your cost and everything is before you actually sign the final papers. And
that's correct. That is absolutely correct. The contract between buyer and seller is mutually exclusive from the deal that you're striking with your lender for your loan terms. That said, when they give you that initial loan estimate, and then you move along the steps and stages to the closing, if there are any numbers that drastically change, they have to issue a new loan estimate or a change in circumstance disclosure. So the borrower is really kept very well informed with TRID.
Okay. So borrowers, please ask questions if you see the closing disclosures and there are things that you're not familiar with. Ask questions, because once you sign, that's it, right?
Absolutely. Always important to ask questions. And, from my perspective, I'm always asking, do you have any questions? Do you understand everything? Does everything look is everything what you were expecting? I think it's really important that a buyer be comfortable sitting at the closing table, signing their documents.
Because it's supposed to be a happy occasion, not feeling like, what am I getting myself into?
Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you should have excited butterflies, not upset butterflies.
Right. Excited butterflies, not upset butterflies. Buying a home, it's should be a happy occasion, especially the closing should be, I'm going to close and ready to pop the champagne. So that should be a very happy, exciting occasion. So ask questions, and the lawyers are there to make sure they answer your question. Moving along, is there 2 different closing disclosures for a buyer and a seller?
Yes. So there are 2 different closing disclosures, and they are quite different. And the reason why there are 2 different closing disclosures is because a buyer's loan information, and remember we spoke that the CD not only has the final figures, but all of the terms of the buyer's loan. That is private financial information covered by all of the privacy laws. Therefore, they did not want the seller's figures to be on the same CD as the buyer's figures, because the seller really shouldn't be privy to the buyer's loan information. So we have a separate closing disclosure just for the seller. And for those of you who are familiar with the HUD settlement statement, it is very similar. The seller's closing disclosure is a simple 2-page document. It lists out only the final figures for the transaction. So it takes the purchase price, adds in any adjustments going to the seller, subtracts out the seller's closing costs, and comes up with a bottom line. There are no disclosure requirements on the sales side. The seller is not privy to having their numbers 3 days before closing because it's not in conjunction with a loan. So it's very much simplified compared to the buyer's closing disclosure. And then we also have what's called an ALTA settlement statement. And there are parties in the transaction, such as the realtors, who need copies of closing disclosures in order to be able to close out their file and issue their final paperwork. And because we're not supposed to provide a borrower CD because it does have that private lending information, they also came out with a form called an ALTA. And the ALTA is basically a list format of all of the buyer's final numbers and all of the seller's final numbers on the document together, much like the old HUD settlement statement was.
So the ALTA is what we get at closing for the realtors, the ALTA. So we're sitting here thinking we're getting the whole closing disclosure, and it's just what we need to see. We don't need to see everything. The buyer is completely protected with this private information. So they don't give it out to the seller nor the realtors. So the realtors get the ALTA. That's
correct. And I will say it is a little confusing because ALTA settlement statements are not required to be prepared for closing. And if there is no ALTA prepared, then it's usually the seller's closing disclosure that's provided to the realtors. So you may get the seller's CD or you may get an ALTA depending on whether or not an ALTA is done.
That's good news. Good to know. Could you, before we finish, break down a little bit what's on the buyer's closing disclosure for us?
Sure. So buyer's closing disclosure is typically a 5-page document. The first page has all of the buyer's information, the seller's information, the closing attorney's information, the lender's information, the closing date. And then it lists out the purchase price, the loan amount, the interest rate. It details whether or not there's any prepayment penalty or balloon payment for the buyer, which 99.9% of the time in Massachusetts, there is not a prepayment penalty or a balloon payment. It lists out what the principal and interest payment is, if there is PMI, and what the monthly amount of PMI is. It also lists out what the monthly charges are for homeowners insurance, real estate taxes, and condo or HOA fees, if those are applicable. And it also tells you whether or not those charges are included in your monthly payment or you have to pay them on your own. It gives you the total amount of the closing costs, and it also gives you the total figure bottom line that you needed to bring to closing as the buyer.
Yes.
Page 2 then breaks down the closing costs. So on this page, you're going to see your lender's origination fees, the processing fees, administration fees, whatever fees the lender may have, the cost of the appraisal, the cost of the credit report, any miscellaneous fees like a flood cert fee or a tax service fee, which are common. It's also going to have the closing attorney's fee. It's going to have the recording fees to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for the documents that need to be registered. It's going to have your prepaid interest, your homeowner's insurance charges, any taxes that are being paid at the time of closing, any funds that are being collected to start up the escrow account, and title insurance costs as well. So literally all of the costs that you're paying are on page 2 of the closing disclosure. On page 3, they give basically a breakdown that does look kind of like an old HUD settlement statement, because it has the purchase price and then plus the closing costs plus any adjustments the buyer owes to the seller. They tally all those up. And then on the bottom section, it tells you the deposit that the buyers put down that they get credit for at closing. It gives the loan amount that they're getting from the bank, any credits that they may be getting from the seller or from the lender. And then it basically does all of the necessary addition and subtraction, and also confirms the bottom line that you see on page 1. Pages 4 and 5 go more into some details about the buyer's loan terms. So this is where they'll give you an estimate for what the buyer would pay in interest over the life of the loan if they made each payment in the exact amount due on the exact due date. It goes over whether a buyer can make partial payments on their loan, whether it gives the property address and lets the buyer know that the note is going to be secured by a mortgage, which gives the lender an interest in the property until the loan is repaid. And then lastly, on the last page, there is a big box that has contact information for the settlement agent or closing attorney, as well as the lender and both real estate agents.
Okay. All right. That's good information. So what would you advise a buyer with the closing disclosure when you get it a few days ahead? Because most people just sign and don't even look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to review it because that's a point at which, let's say it came over and you thought that the interest rate was wrong, or you thought that the loan amount was wrong, or you had already paid your insurance for the first year, but it didn't have that reflected. Those are questions you can ask or issues you can have fixed in that 3-day period. Rather than at the time you get the final and then saying, oh, wait, well, this doesn't match the one that I got before, or this wasn't what I was expecting. So it just really gives a period for review. And I think it's important to review it. And also to understand that there may be last minute adjustments between that figure and the final figure.
Okay. Thank you very much, Melissa. This has been very helpful. And to our viewers, our goal is to bring you information and insight to help you with your next move. So look out for more videos coming up, and always thankful for you visiting Living the Dream in Central Massachusetts. Please take time to subscribe so you can get more information. Subscribe to our channel. Thank you, Melissa. We appreciate it. Hopefully we'll reach back out to you for more topics.
That sounds great. Thank you for having me.
Have a wonderful day.